If I give you two assets like this, we can probably agree that this one looks better. But why? What is it that we need to change to this one to improve it? Well, identifying what's wrong or isn't working is often about changing perspective on your art. And there are a lot of small tricks you can use to identify issues quicker. So I'm just going to name some tricks in no particular order. Flipping your art. Regardless of what you do, I think you should practice flipping your sprite while you are drawing. Then draw a bit on the flipped version and then flip it back. So to illustrate why this is important, let's take a look at this early version of my character while I was still designing it. It's not the worst, but if we flip it, we immediately see that the character is off balance and leaning a lot. But this doesn't only go for characters. We can take the scene that I covered in a previous video, we just take a screenshot of it, open our drawing software, and then flip it. And hopefully you also see something that looks kind of off. I hadn't actually noticed this when making the scene, but when I flipped it, we can see that it kind of looks bad that both of these vines lean almost exactly the same. So since we notice it, we can fix it. Post-processing effects. Post-processing is essentially visual effects that will affect your entire scene and can make the scene pop a bit more. But it's actually something that is useful while you're still making your scene. Suppose we had this scene and we were slightly unsure about the colors. Maybe we want it to look slightly more frightening, but we don't really know what colors to go for. Instead of going into your drawing software and just changing the colors of all your assets, we can change the colors of the entire scene at once, basically color balancing your scene. And now we can see if we perhaps want the scene slightly more purple and red, or maybe we want to make the dark colors quite blue and then the light colors kind of a sickly yellow. And once we do have something we like, then we can go back and adjust our assets. But now we kind of know what we need to do. And we can even do this to scenes that aren't so uniform to begin with. Here, for instance, the entire scene kind of clashes and looks bad. And we can see here that when we make these adjustments, it doesn't really start looking good, but we can start to see what types of adjustments that might actually work. You can do this way more complex than I did in a previous video, where I use gradient shaders to apply to different assets and different parts of your scenes. So you can basically do all of your colors in the engine. But that's more of a different process. I just want to show that this can be used as a check. Separating your layers. So this is more of a workflow tip. Often when you begin making art, you're making lots of different choices. Line art, shapes, texturing, colors. But suppose your asset looks bad because of the texture. How do you find that out? Well, this is where separating each aspect into its own layer helps. For every new thing you do, you make a new layer for it. Now since you separate your line art, your highlights, your shadows, it becomes easier to isolate which part of your asset that isn't working. So if we're unsure if the texture is problematic, we go into the layer, reduce the opacity. If it looks better, then we know we need to fix it. I think it's a good way to iterate. You don't need to know why it works, you just need to know that this looks better than this. You can even use the same principle for your scene by separating your platforming area from your background, and then adjusting it back and forth. Even if you don't intend to use atmospheric perspective, this is useful because it helps you identify how much attention your background demands. If this looks better than this, then you know you need to change something in regards to clutter. Once you've built up your intuition, then you can more easily move away from this approach, because it is a bit of a slower process. But I think it helps kind of guide your problem solving. You just adjust each layer one by one, and iterate your way to improving. Zooming out. So this is a method you should basically always use. And you do this to check if your asset or design is clean and reads well. If we look at the standard window setting in Sprite, we have this small preview window in the corner. And this is extremely useful to do, not just for pixel art. So the reason you do this is that it can be extremely difficult to gauge how good the asset will look if you look at it zoomed in. So any artist will either constantly zoom back out when drawing or use a preview window like this. And if you're doing traditional art, then you will back up. So first of all, this helps you check how the asset looks at its actual size instead of 5 times as big. But this is super important if you want to make simple and clean art. If you can make your asset super small and the asset still looks good, then you know that you have a clean and simple shape. To show you what I mean, we can look at assets like these. We clearly see that there are different types of strange bushes. But if we zoom out and look at them when they're really small, they actually look really bad. And all the detail that was there is now lost. And this is actually what will happen in game. So what I like to do when I make my asset is to zoom it out a lot, and if I can still clearly see it as a bush when it looks smaller than it ever would in game, then I know the asset will look nice in game. Checking the silhouette. So one thing that you might not have considered before is the importance of your silhouette or the shape of your asset. For instance, if I have a distinct shape in an asset, it will stand out when it is repeated and make the scene look less organic. So you generally want to identify this as quick as possible. This is one reason for checking your silhouette, but it actually goes further than this. Look at all these silhouettes. Look at how clear and distinct they are. They look good because they read well. And I'm not saying that I'm the best at it, but if your character looks like a blob when you look at the silhouette, then the character is most likely not going to look good. So you can check this if you take all your layers, merge them together, press Ctrl C, then you press Ctrl C to undo the merging of all the layers, and then afterwards you press Ctrl V. Now you still have all your layers of the original asset, but also have a clean version of the asset on a single layer. Now we can just take this copied layer and go into Adjustments, HSL, and then drag down the brightness to 0. And now if the silhouette looks nice, then it's more likely that your asset will look nice. It's not something you have to do all the time, but it can be useful to check for some small improvements. It's basically the only reason this mushroom character has these weird ears. The silhouette looked better. Blurring or squinting. So blurring is generally talked about in terms of readability, but it can also be used for something that is quite underrated. And that is to blur your entire scene. Now you can do this in engine with a shader, but if you aren't using a shader, just take a screenshot of your scene and blur it in your drawing software. So this actually does two things. If we take this blurred starting scene in a robot named Fight and look at the first things that stand out from this scene, we can actually kind of isolate a lot of different things here. And more specifically, we can isolate these shapes to be roughly similar, and sure enough, if we unblur it, those shapes we pointed out correspond to the platforming area. If we now look at this scene, can you guess where the platforms are? Well, I personally can't, and if we unblur it, we can see how poorly this platform is visible. It's a fairly easy mistake to make, and blurring your scene can help you spot if you have a readability issue quite quickly. You can actually get away with having quite cluttered scenes without it being difficult reading the platforms. Look at this scene for instance. If we want to read the main shapes of this blurred scene, we can quite easily see this whole chunk of platform. And sure enough, we unblur it. The scene is quite cluttered, but it still reads fairly decently. But this blurring trick is not only useful for checking readability, but also for checking your colors. And if we look at two of my own scenes, we can take this one, blur it, and it looks quite decent. I kind of like the color choices in this scene. But if we take a look at this scene, even if I do actually like the staging of the scene, the colors are really bad. And if we blur it, we can kind of see that. It has no depth and just looks kind of like a brown mess. Obviously you can generally check if the colors look good just by looking at the scene. But if you're having problems figuring out what is wrong with your scene, this is a method you can use to just isolate the colors and ignore the shapes for a second. Black and white. Now while I do think that blurring your scene can be helpful to notice some readability issues, the absolute best way to check readability is to make your scene black and white. That way you can see if the values of the background elements and foreground elements blend together. And you do this in order to make sure that your scene reads better. The reason you want to check this in grayscale is because readability issues become significantly more obvious when you see it in black and white. But another thing that can happen if you only rely on color choices to separate elements is that you could accidentally be making your game atrocious to play for those with color blindness, where you for instance might think that this has really good separation, but a number of those in your audience would actually be seeing this. And in that instance, having a decent value separation would be better for everyone. Feedback. One of the more obvious, but perhaps most important methods to check what is wrong with your art is just to ask someone else. But suppose the person you are asking for visual feedback aren't really saying anything other than, "It looks good." Well, in that case, you could make lots of different versions of a thing and just ask which one they prefer. You could, for instance, test different line art versions on an asset, and you just ask them to pick their favorite. Once you've gotten them to mention their favorite, you can generally also ask them why, and they might be able to give you a more concrete perspective that you can analyze. That way you aren't really dealing with a person who doesn't want to hurt your feelings, and you'll be able to get a small incremental improvement on your art. And we don't need to do everything perfectly, we just need it to be a bit better than it was yesterday. If you absolutely have no one to ask, and just let it sit for a day or two and come back and see if you notice anything yourself. References. Go onto Pinterest, go outside, or Google Images. I like to save the pictures into Pureref so that I can look at them all at the same time. Pureref is kind of quick to use because you can just press Windows-Shift-S and mark the image you're interested in referencing, and then press Ctrl-V in Pureref, and now you have all your references side by side. I obviously collect books as well, which does help you get quite niche references, but I think this is more for people that like weird books. It's probably not really worth the investment. Thanks for watching. Bye.